In November of 2015, a young man and his partner bought a house on Main Street in the village of Cottingley, located in West Yorkshire. Behind the house on Main Street runs a brook known as Cottingley Beck. On the other side of the brook is a dell with lush greens and trees. It's an idyllic setting. And from the kitchen, you can see the garden which leads down to the brook. The garden and that brook are the setting of a story that began a century ago at that very spot. But the man didn't know that when he purchased the house. To him, it was a quaint little home in an even quainter setting. It wasn't until a neighbor commented that he'd bought the fairy house that he began to realize there was more to the home and its garden than met the eye. There was history there, one that included 2 young girls, a camera, the renowned author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and a set of pictures that captivated the world. It was way back in 1917 that the little village of Cottingley had a strange encounter with fairies. In 1917, England was in the midst of a world war. The Germans were using submarines around the British Isles in an attempt to cut the people of Britain off from food, supplies, and imports. It was a trying time and a desperate time. And in the middle of all of this, 9-year-old Frances Griffiths traveled with her mother from South Africa to Britain to stay with her aunt's family. Her aunt lived in the small village of Cottingley, and Frances's mother promised her that she would love it, as well as her cousin Elsie Wright, who was 16. Frances was nervous, of course, and a bit excited. When they arrived at her aunt's, her excitement was realized when she learned that behind her aunt's house was a garden, a brook, and plenty of places to hide, play, and imagine that she was in a different world. Those horrible stories she heard her mother tell about a war going on all around them, but too far away to see, could hopefully be forgotten. Even better, her and her cousin Elsie hit it off and were soon inseparable despite the age difference. Life was good for young Frances. As far as their parents were concerned, the girls could do as they wished during the day. Elsie, being the elder of the 2, was the responsible one, and she would see to it that they kept out of trouble. Not that there was much trouble to get into in Cottingley anyway, but they were up to something. Many afternoons saw them coming home with damp dresses and wet shoes, and when pressed, they would simply say that they were playing down by the brook. There were stepping stones down there which they used to cross over to the dell. It wasn't their fault that the stones were wet. They were bound to slip once in a while. As this seemed to be a common occurrence, their mothers asked what was so special about the brook and the dell. Couldn't they find a better place to play, and one which didn't involve constantly having to clean and dry their dresses? Frances and Elsie looked at each other before answering. There was something special about the garden, the brook, and the dell. There were fairies there. Their mothers were adamant, no more coming back with damp clothes. But the girls insisted. They wanted to see the fairies. And to prove it, they would take their picture. So, armed with Elsie's dad's camera, the 2 girls promptly disappeared and raced down to the brook, across stepping stones, and into the dell. And then, they waited. A short time later, they returned to the house, beaming. They had their picture. Elsie's dad took the camera, removed the photographic plate, and developed it. As he watched, the picture that gradually came into view was astonishing. There was 9-year-old Frances standing in the brook and leaning against the edge of the bank. In front of her, prominent for all to see, were 4 dancing fairies. One fairy played a flute-like instrument, and they all appeared jubilant at having their picture taken. Elsie's dad was skeptical. Elsie was a very creative young girl, and he wouldn't put it past her to have come up with a way to stage the picture. The fairies could very well be pieces of paper. Amused at the ingenuity, he presented the family with their picture, and they again asked the girls to keep out of mischief and to keep their clothes drier from now on. The fairies would understand. And 2 months later, in September, the girls came back with another picture. This time it was Elsie's turn to be in the picture. Gone with the fairies, however. In this image, Elsie is sitting in the grass with her hand held out to a little gnome, which appears about to jump into her lap. Which is exactly what it was doing, she said. Frances had managed to capture the little gnome in mid-leap. As the picture is in black and white, the girls explained that the gnome wore black tights, a red shirt, and a matching red cap. Again, Mr. Wright thought that the picture, while creative, was most definitely staged, and told the girls that the camera was off limits to them. No more pictures. He even went so far as to search the girls' room for some evidence that they had made the fairies themselves. His efforts didn't pay off, but his stance was firm. Polly Wright, Elsie's mother, wasn't as skeptical. She thought that perhaps the pictures might be real after all. The girls seemed genuine, and their stories hadn't changed, so she was slowly coming around to the fact that there may be fairies in their garden after all. Maybe they showed themselves to the girls because they posed no threat and they were innocent. So, a few months later, Polly attended a lecture presented by the Bradford Theosophical Society. In her bag were the 2 photographs. After the lecture, she showed them to the speaker. Could these be real, she asked. The speaker was impressed, so impressed that the pictures soon ended up in front of Edward Gardner, one of the Society's most respected members. Gardner handed them over to Harold Snelling. Snelling was an expert when it came to cameras and photography. After hearing what was going on with the pictures, Mr. Wright was certain that the truth would soon come out. He was sure Snelling would take one look at the 2 pictures and declare them to be well-staged fakes. Mr. Wright was wrong. Not only did Snelling say that the images in the picture appeared to be genuine, he could also find no indication that they had been paper cutouts or models. Whatever the girls had captured on camera, he could see no evidence of fakery. Now that Snelling's favorable opinion was out there, the pictures began to make the rounds. If you were a spiritualist or a member of a theosophical society, 2 pictures of fairies served as vindication that there was another world out there, one often invisible to our own, but real nonetheless. The material world might be at war, but the immaterial world continued on with better things to do and more pleasant activities to pursue. Imagine the girls and their parents' surprise when they received a letter expressing interest in the pictures from the creator of Sherlock Holmes himself, the author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Doyle was a spiritualist, and the pictures for him couldn't have come at a better time. He was, in fact, preparing to write an article on fairies for the Strand magazine, and some things were simply meant to be. For the girls to pop up with their pictures at this time was almost too good to be true. To be able to use them as talking points in his article would lend it the credibility it deserved. But first, Doyle needed a second, or even multiple, opinions on whether or not the pictures had been faked or doctored in some way. So he brought them to the Kodak company, where they were examined by more than one technician. Again, the pictures passed the test. So, using the pictures as the masthead of his article, Doyle published it in 1920, masking the true identities of the girls with fake names to protect their anonymity. Neither he nor the parents wanted the entirety of England descending upon Cottingley Village, and the article was a sensation, and the debate was on. Were the pictures fake, or were fairies real? Emboldened and excited, Doyle asked for more pictures, and the girls obliged. In August of 1920, 3 more pictures were developed. The first shows a fairy leaping up in front of Frances, who draws her head back to avoid having the fairy's wings touch her nose. The next one shows a fairy holding what appears to be a small flower, which she is presenting to Elsie. The last, or 5th, if you want to consider all of the pictures in total, is perhaps the most controversial. Neither girl appears in this photo, and it shows not 1 or 2 fairies, but multiple translucent fairies. It almost appears as if the fairies are oblivious to having their picture taken and are enjoying the early afternoon sun. Doyle was overjoyed. and again used the pictures for his second fairy article in the Strand magazine. Doyle was so enamored with the concept and the pictures that he wrote an entire book on the subject in 1922 called The Coming of the Fairies. But there were skeptics, many of which pointed out that the fairies seemed to sport fairly modern hairstyles, and still others pointed out that they did indeed appear to be paper cutouts. But for years, the girls claimed they were real. But years and age, and perhaps a little bit of irritation at the constant questioning, sometimes, or often, leads to the truth. In 1983, 63 years after the last photograph was taken, both Frances and Elsie admitted that they had in fact created the fairies themselves. Using illustrations from a children's book, Elsie had copied the maidens' pictures within, gifted them with wings, and cut them out. They then used hat pins to support the cutouts. After the pictures had attracted widespread attention, and especially that of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, they were too afraid to admit the truth. So they kept quiet and let the world argue about the picture's authenticity for decades. The girls did disagree about one thing, that being the fifth and final picture. To her dying day, Frances insisted that the final image was real and that the fairies had appeared to her completely by surprise one morning, so she'd snapped their photo. It wasn't until it was developed that she realized she'd captured them. Of all the pictures, it is the most creative and ethereal in its use of light and opacity. Frances passed away in 1986, and Elsie followed her cousin 2 years later. In December 2019, the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford announced that it had acquired the third of the 3 cameras used by the girls and is adding it to its collection, along with the photographs currently on display at the museum. But talk about fairies in Cottingley didn't end in the 1920s. In the 1980s, a forester who spent quite a bit of time in Cottingley Woods came forward with a story of his own encounter. One day, during a light rain, he saw 3 10-inch tall fairies appear in the forest. They stared at him, disappeared, and he never saw them again. Perhaps that fifth and final photograph taken by Frances that long ago August morning is real after all. Thank you for listening. Now, if you haven't already, please subscribe and leave a review. It really does help the show and helps others to find it. And if you know someone who might enjoy the show, please tell them about it. You can find out more information and all of the references that went into this episode by going to strangeencounters.org. I would really like to hear your suggestions for future episodes, and if you've had a strange encounter with something unusual or paranormal, I would love to hear it. Visit the contact page for information on submitting your story. And until next time, please take care of yourself. It's a strange world out there.
After my should see, save, making show, I'm visualizing the